She was a woman, she was an English woman, she was a bossy English woman.
This Scottish miracle didn't happen by accident.
Here was a woman who was just, she was such a megalomaniac.
I hope to go on and on.
It's very difficult, I think, for anyone in Scotland today to say that Margaret Thatcher was a positive force.
The message is, Mr. President, that Tory philosophy works when we have the courage to put it into practice and the perseverance to see it through.
This talk of the naked individual, of greed being good, of if you sort out your own family and your own private concerns, society will look after itself, I think people just thought that was nonsense.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Would a time traveller from 1979 recognise Scotland today? We used to have steelworks, now we have Starbucks. Mrs Thatcher might have rewritten the prayer of St Francis. Where there were shipyards, may we bring banking. Where there were coal mines, may we bring business parks. Where there was hard work and honest industry, may we bring retail. Scotland 30 years ago rejected her again and again, but it couldn't stop her one-woman revolution. Look around you now, and what you see is the land that Maggie built. But there was one revolution that she didn't want, but which she couldn't stop either. Scotland, in response to Hurricane Maggie, asserted itself in a new way. She didn't mean to, but she loosened the ties that bound the Anglo-Scottish Union. She let the genie of Scottish national aspiration out of the 300-year-old bottle of British sovereignty. And we haven't heard the end of it yet. When you think of the Thatcher years, you think above all of the dole queues, the mass unemployment, the industrial dereliction, and the despair of it all. But look at Scotland today. It's a different place. It's more prosperous than it was even in the current economic downturn. It has its own parliament, and Edinburgh's more of a national capital than it's been for 300 years. Scotland never voted for Margaret Thatcher, and she remains unforgiven here. It's as though we built her into our national mythology as a kind of wicked stepmother who came to us uninvited and remains unloved. But isn't it time to go beyond the myths and to look again at what those years revealed about us as a country and at the changed Scotland they bequeathed to us? Thatcher deplored Britain in decline. She blamed the trade unions. She blamed high public spending. She blamed big government. Her promise to wage war on all three and to put the great back into Britain chimed with the popular mood. At least in most of England it did. And Scotland was not yet all that different.
Margaret Thatcher was not as radical when she became Prime Minister as she subsequently became, not because she didn't have the instincts or the potential, but because the objectives in 1979 were relatively modest: to deal with inflation, to try and bring some order to the trade union situation, and to help give a kickstart to the economy through the private sector.
Inflation was taking off again. In short, we were a nation which all too plainly had lost its way and almost abandoned hope of ever finding it again.
I don't think even Margaret Thatcher realised, or any of us realised, was once you start that process, if you've got the guts to do it and if you've got a bit of imagination, actually you could create a whole new economy.
And by the effectiveness of its persuasion of the electorate...
Every revolution has its vanguard of ideologues. In Scotland, a group of young Tory radicals championed free market capitalism and challenged the genial old moderates then in charge of the Scottish Conservative Party.
If anything, the younger and more radical elements in the party were being encouraged at that time. Because the Scottish Tory establishment was a load of old fuddy-duddies who just rejected all new ideas, there really did seem to be a chance to adopt radical ideas that would appeal to the Scottish people, that would not be seen simply as an imposition from England.
Mrs Thatcher had made a clean break with the consensual politics of her predecessor, Edward Heath. Suddenly, Labour found that it was the real small c Conservative Party, defending the status quo against a radical reforming Prime Minister.
I guessed that it was going to be very bad indeed, worse than the Ted Heath years, for example, because Ted Heath, by Thatcher's standards, was a moderate, whereas Thatcher was a right-wing extremist in economic terms as well as in social terms. So, yes, I feared the worst.
The narrative that I was brought up with was that once there was an evil world in which the state didn't look after people and in which people could starve to death. It was the world recorded by Charles Dickens and all the rest of it, where there was no national health service, where education was dependent on your ability to pay for it. I was brought up to think of these things, and I don't think wrongly, as evident evils. And I was brought up to think that the British welfare state of the post-war period had resolved that and had determined to create a society in which these evils would no longer exist. So I was actually quite viscerally shocked when I met this kind of flying wedge of people who thought that the welfare state was a bad thing, an evil thing, and ought to be rolled back and ought to be replaced by a much more rigorous set of market disciplines.
The welfare state wasn't all they wanted to roll back. They also put an end to the Tories' long-standing commitment to a Scottish Assembly.
No sound or honourable basis for the great constitutional change which Labour have proposed. And the final insult would be for this dying government to try to bend our constitution to keep themselves in power for a few more wretched weeks.
One of the first things that she did when she came into power was to repeal the legislation setting up the Scottish Assembly, and that cleared the decks, as it were, for her to impose policies on the people of Scotland against the will of the people of Scotland.
Some people say that we're not a Scottish party, but neither are we an English party, nor a Welsh party, nor an Irish party. We're a party of the whole United Kingdom.
Mrs Thatcher's war on the old economy was about to change Scotland forever. Market forces prepared to do battle with state subsidy right here in Motherwell. Government, not the market, had brought the Ravenscraig steelworks to Scotland. It was the linchpin of Scottish industry, the towering symbol of post-war economic planning. State planning, that is. And the state arranged for it to buy coal from the state-owned mines and to sell steel to the state-aided car manufacturers and shipyards. The steelworkers took on the new government almost immediately. They went on strike in 1980 for higher wages. And they won. Their 19% pay rise was a red rag to the Thatcherite bull. State-owned British Steel was now losing £2 billion a year. How the Thatcherites hated all that. Ravenscraig came to stand for all that was wrong with Britain in decline. Its days and that of an old and settled idea of what Scotland was were now numbered.
The steelworks that once stood here operated around the clock, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, without pause, for decades. This is where those famous cooling towers once stood. It pulled in generation after generation of school leavers and kept them for life, turning them into a highly skilled industrial workforce. It was a pillar of Scotland's whole economy. That's why the battle to save it became symbolic of something much bigger. It became a fight for a certain conception of Scotland itself, of what Scotland should be. And when you ask yourself who won that battle, take a look at what's here now. You would hardly know that there had ever been industrial activity at all.
The largest industrial site in Scotland greened over in the battle against state subsidy. How did it happen?
In Scotland, more than in England, we were dependent on the large, heavy nationalised industries, all of which were technically bankrupt, all of which were dependent on handout by government, all of which were inefficient, overmanned and subject to trade union militancy. And it was inevitable that those industries could not survive at the size at which they were. They had to be reduced in size, and that was what happened.
perhaps the Scottish economy was over-reliant on these heavy industries, and there was a need perhaps to reduce the number of people employed in these industries. But to say that these industries should be completely annihilated, I don't think it makes economic sense. And the pace of change was such that you had thousands, hundreds of thousands of people thrown out of work.
The Tories, in rising to the battle, knew they were taking on public opinion, knew they were courting unpopularity.
Sometimes it's presented as if this was a conscious decision, that somehow ministers put on hair shirts and said it's going to be terribly painful and so forth. And of course there's an element of that. If you're going to do something difficult, then if it wasn't going to hurt, then it would have been done years ago. I mean, politicians actually quite like to be popular, and therefore they don't opt to do things that they know will be difficult and painful and unpopular unless they believe it profoundly to be in the national interest. So that was always going to be a difficult problem. In political terms, it was always going to be a more difficult problem in Scotland and in Wales because the Conservative Party did not have the same political strength.
The price they paid in public support didn't deter them. One by one, Scotland's industrial giants failed the tests the government and the market set for them. In 1981, Peugeot Talbot closed its Linwood plant. Perhaps 13,000 livelihoods gone. Ravenscraig lost one of its biggest customers. Then the Invergordon aluminium smelter and the Corpach pulp mill, both vital employers for the Highlands, both now swept away. In 1985, British Leyland at Bathgate was no more, and with it the assembly of heavy trucks in Scotland. Linwood, Bathgate, then the Gartcosh steel mill. The names worked their way into protest songs and popular consciousness. As Hurricane Maggie swept through, all Scotland, it seemed, was shutting up shop. And Scotland began to feel the tug of an old sentiment, that of victimhood. It didn't accept the economic rationale of it.
Ravenscraig had the lowest man-hours per tonne figure in the whole of British Steel, which meant that we were the most successful plant in British Steel. But the plans of British Steel was certainly to close Ravenscraig eventually, and they were trying everything they could do to do that. But they had to take away the economic argument from us, and we still had the economic argument up until Gartcosh went.
We were at the centre of world manufacture. In what we were doing, and aided, of course, by the oil industry. So we had a real chance at that stage to take those industries forward rather than to close them down. And I used to get upset about people that you would have known who were big men in the steel industry in Lanarkshire, working in the furnaces. In their own locality, they were big people being just cast onto the scrap heap. And so Scotland's sense of itself, of its skills, of its what Scotland was about, was around those industries.
At Ravenscraig, the fight went on. Workers walked in forlorn protest from Motherwell to Downing Street, evoking the hungry 1930s and the glory days of labour history. It didn't work. Mrs. Thatcher refused to see them. Ravenscraig gave up the ghost in 1992.
Do you think Scotland was being discriminated against?
The Scottish steel industry was being discriminated against. Scotland in general, I don't know. Somebody else could have put that argument forward, but the Scottish steel industry was certainly being discriminated against. They destroyed an excellent plant at Ravenscraig.
That belief that Mrs. Thatcher was deliberately and unnecessarily laying waste to Scottish industry became widespread, part of the tale that Scotland told itself. But wasn't she simply blamed for a process that was taking place globally, and even before she came to power?